Hello there, and welcome to the I Never Knew podcast, also known as Inc. This show dives into the life experiences of people who have been through it all and have come through the other side stronger, better, and triumphant. Each story is raw, authentic, and, at times, heartbreaking. One thing joins it all together: the fact that the stories can help the listener learn and grow. Hosted by life coach Maureen, she sits down each episode with a new guest who will empower the listener to set out on their self-discovery journey and start to heal. Now you'll be joined by Maureen and her special guest. Please enjoy the show.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of I Never Knew, But My Dog Did podcast. I am Maureen Scanlon, your hostess and life coach Maureen, as most of you know me. Today, I'm so excited to have such a wonderful guest is going to give us so much information, and I have questions, and I told her I'm hoping I'm going to get all the questions that I think listeners you would want to ask her. So let me tell you about her. So author Lisa Skinner is a behavioral specialist with the expertise in Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. In her 30-plus year career working with family members and caregivers, Lisa has taught them how to successfully navigate the many challenges that accompany this heartbreaking disease. Lisa is both a certified dementia practitioner and is also a certified dementia care trainer through the Alzheimer's Association. She also holds a degree in human behavior. She has 2 books, Truth Lies in Alzheimer's, Its Secret Faces, and her #1 best-selling book, Not All Who Wander Need Be Lost. It was written after someone as someone who has had 8 family members diagnosed with dementia. Lisa found her calling in helping others through the struggle, and they can have a better quality relationship with their loved ones through education and offering workshops on counterintuitive solutions and tools to help people effectively manage the symptoms of this brain disease. Without further ado, oh my goodness, welcome, Miss Lisa.
Thanks, Maureen. Thank you so much for having me on the show. This is such an important topic for so many people, and so many families are just, terribly impacted by this disease. So this is very, very special to me to come on and talk about it with you.
I love it, and I'm so grateful that you are here with us, because I agree with you, and I think it's becoming more rampant than ever. And I think everybody knows someone that has been affected by dementia and Alzheimer's. And this is not just an old people's disease anymore. There's things that are happening, and this is what I cannot wait to dive into. I don't know if you, or if listeners, those of you who know me, I started in nursing, and I actually started in an Alzheimer's unit, in a locked Alzheimer's unit. Yes.
My goodness, I didn't know.
I see. It was like, that's how you speak to me. I see that, and I'm like, oh, this is amazing. And then my own grandmother passed from dementia and Alzheimer's, and she was like a second mother to me more than a grandmother. So there's so much information and myth out there. One of the things that you said, and listeners, this might knock you off your chair as it did myself. One of the things that she said is that in 2050 worldwide, they're saying that the number of people who will develop Alzheimer's disease will triple. And that is so scary to me.
It really is. And those are projections that are given to us not only by the Alzheimer's Association, specifically in the US, but the National Institutes on Aging, the World Health Organization. So if a cure or a treatment is not found by the year 2050, and that's not that far away, what are we talking about, 22 years? the number of people who will develop Alzheimer's disease are expected to triple from the numbers that we know suffer from it. Well, not even know, that we believe suffer from it today, because not all those people have been recorded. There's a lot of people out there suffering from the disease that we don't actually have a record of. So, 6.7 million people in the US today is a best guess. I'm sure there's more than that. That number is projected to triple in the US. And we are talking over 100 million people worldwide that will develop Alzheimer's disease by the year 2050. So those numbers are pretty staggering if we continue to go on the path that we currently are on, with no cure and no treatment even.
Yeah. It's all like this big unknown still. And even in the day and age of technology that we live in, and all of the medical advances and medications, it's still this big unknown. So here on I Never Knew, we'd like to start off with your story and how, because I really feel, I always say, when you're talking to someone, it's so much more relatable when they've been there and they can say, I've been there and I've done that. And so you had 8 family members diagnosed with dementia or Alzheimer's. Tell us about that and how that really set the trajectory of you wanting to do this.
Okay. Well, it all just kind of fell into place for me. But my very first experience with Alzheimer's disease was close to 50 years ago, when my grandmother, and like you, Maureen, my grandmother and I were very close. She lived only a couple miles from us. We saw her regularly. After I got my driver's license, I started driving over to her house to continue our regular visits. And one day I went over there and was completely taken off guard when we were sitting in her living room, and she started to tell me about birds that were living in her mattress that would come out at night and peck at her face. And then she proceeded to tell me about the rats that were running all over her house, and they were trying to invade her home, and the men who were constantly breaking into her house and stealing her jewelry. And oh, by the way, they are going to kill me. And I'm listening to this as a 16-year-old. I never even heard my grandmother tell a fib before. And here's all these far-fetched stories are coming out of her mouth. And I just didn't know how to respond to that. So I said, okay, Grandma, let's go in your room and check this out. So I led her into her bedroom, and I threw her covers and her sheets and her blankets off. And I'm saying to her, okay, well, show me where they are. And I flipped up her mattress and looked underneath it. And I said, show me where these birds are coming in and out of. I'm not really seeing where they're accessing your mattress. And she says to me so brilliantly, she says, oh, you might not be able to see them, Lisa, but they are there. They're very, very clever. And I left it at that. I wanted to argue with her, but I was taught not to argue with your elders. And we just always had that kind of a relationship. So I just played along with it. And it turns out years and years later, when I started doing this professionally, I learned that that was actually the best practice for somebody who's having what she was having, which is called a false belief or a delusion. So I didn't argue with her. I didn't try to correct her. I just pretended like I was accepting what she was telling me, even though I have to honestly say it's probably one of the most far-fetched stories I'd ever heard. Birds living in your mattress, and they only come out at night to peck at your face. So anyway, as it turns out, unbeknownst to me, my grandmother was also calling the police 4, 5, 6 times a day, reporting these stories to the police. And they did send officers out on a couple occasions to check out her claims. And of course, they didn't find anything or any evidence of anything. So the calls continued. And then one day I was at home with my mom, and there was a knock on the door, and the chief of police was standing at our door. My mom invited him in, and she basically said to my mother, "Your mother is calling us up to 6 or more times a day, reporting birds living in her mattress, men trying to harm her, stealing things, rats invading her house." And he said, "Look, we don't have the time or the resources to continue to take these calls and respond to them." And then he looks at her and he says, "You've got to do something with her. She's a nutcase. We just can't handle these calls day in and day out." And I'm listening to this, and I just felt this rage come over me. And I thought to myself, how dare he? This is the chief of police. This is his job to protect the civilians. And he comes over and he dares call my grandmother a nut without even, bothering to ask, well, is there something going on with her? Has she been tested? Has she seen a doctor? He just blatantly called her a nutcase. And that stuck with me all the way through this day. I've never forgotten that. And that was my first experience. Back then, I said to my mother, I said, "Mom, did you know that this was going on with Grandma?" And she said, "Yes, but we don't talk about it," which was very common almost 50 years ago. It's still common today.
It is. It really is. Now, was that now in your professional life that you've learned of all of this, is that a sign of dementia or actually Alzheimer's? What's the distinction between that?
So that's actually a very important distinction. So let me clarify that for everybody, because there's a lot of confusion between what is Alzheimer's, what is dementia. A lot of people think it's the same thing. A lot of people think they're two completely separate diseases. So the best way for me to explain the difference is Alzheimer's disease is an actual brain disease. There are over 100 known brain diseases that cause dementia. So dementia is not a specific disease. It's actually a syndrome. And when we use the term dementia, we're using it as an umbrella or broad-based term to refer to the symptoms that brain diseases cause. So let me explain it to you, kind of like getting the flu or a cold, because we've all had one at some point in our life. And we know we're coming down with something because of the symptoms that we get at the time. Some of us will get a fever. Some of us will get chills and body aches and headaches. And, they vary from person to person. But it's the first clue that something's going on with us, that we might want to go to the doctor and find out, is this the flu I have? Is this a cold I have? And more currently, is this COVID? But our first clue are the symptoms. Okay. So when we refer to dementia, think of it as the symptoms that you're starting to show that give you the clue that you're coming down with something. So dementia really is a term referring to symptomology.
Wow. I love that you just clarified that for us, because I know they've been grouped together. I know people have said, they have dementia, but not Alzheimer's. Is this true or false that Alzheimer's can only be confirmed once people have passed and they do an autopsy?
Yes, to date, as of this conversation, that is still accurate.
Okay.
So really what it comes down to is a best guess and a process of elimination. So what doctors will do when people start showing the signs of an Alzheimer's disease or one of the other brain diseases, they go to their doctor and they tell the doctor, just like we do when we think we are coming down with a cold or a flu or something. This is what I've seen my mother experiencing, or my father, or my grandmother. And this has been going on for quite some time. So the first thing they do is they try to figure out what it's not.
Okay. Yeah.
And after eliminating other possibilities that mimic very similar symptomology to this dementia, as of today, they can narrow it down to a brain disease. Alzheimer's is the most common one of the brain diseases that causes dementia. But let me just kind of give you this caveat. So do you remember a musician, very famous in his day? His name is Chris Christopherson.
Yes.
I loved him as a teenager growing up, and I admired him. And so as it turns out, Chris Christopherson, now this is a perfect example of the point I'm trying to drive home here. Chris Christopherson was showing all the signs of Alzheimer's disease, or one of the brain diseases that causes dementia. And he was actually given a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease and treated for 3 years for Alzheimer's disease. Then somehow he had a friend, or his doctor had a friend, and they decided to send him for a Lyme disease test. Well, guess what? He tested positive for Lyme disease. He did not have Alzheimer's disease. He had Lyme disease, and some of those symptoms mimic the same symptoms that we see with dementia. So after being treated for 3 years, they changed his diagnosis because there is a test that will show positive or negative for Lyme. And this is the point I'm trying to make. It really comes down to a process of elimination. And because today, the only definitive way to really accurately diagnose Alzheimer's is only still through an autopsy, we have to give it, our best effort to try to whittle it down to what it's not. But in that case, it still doesn't mean that it's necessarily Alzheimer's. Now, that was kind of an exception for the case, but it's a true story.
I love that example. And one of the things that I noticed in my patients, especially when they were elderly, was when they had urinary tract infections. It caused a lot of this cognitive diminishing, and it actually showed itself as confusion, forgetfulness, dizziness, a lot of the same symptoms. And then you'd clear up the UTI, and then they were actually more clear. So I love that you're saying there are so many things that can kind of fool us into automatically jumping to that Alzheimer's diagnosis.
What you're saying is absolutely true. And I can't tell you how many people have approached me and believed that their loved one had developed Alzheimer's or, another brain disease that causes dementia. And the difference is when it's caused by a urinary tract infection, it comes on very quickly. Alzheimer's disease or other related dementia does not. It takes years before the symptoms are so obvious that you really realize something's wrong. So that's a difference. But I have had a lot of people say to me, just all of a sudden, take her to the doctor, have them check for a UTI. And a lot of the times it is, because it just doesn't happen overnight like it can with a urinary tract infection.
I had a guest on a few months ago, and his name was Matthew, and he walked us through the journey with his wife, who actually was diagnosed in her 50s. And so I want to talk about the distinction between the early onset and the later onset. And his experience with his wife was that she had sort of a psychotic break. And then from there, she really diminished. Is that something that you've seen before where we can have sort of a psychotic moment, or is that something that was already there and then this just kind of brought it to light?
That's a great question, and I've seen it. Well, let me put it to you this way. We kind of have a saying in our industry that if you've met one person with dementia, you've met one person with dementia. And the reason why is because every single person experiences it differently. It's caused by, not everybody is suffering from the same brain disease. And the other thing that really complicates the mix is that people can be suffering from more than one cause of dementia at the same time. So people can have Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia at the same time.
Oh.
So impacting different parts of the brain, or they can have Lewy body disease and Alzheimer's disease going on simultaneously. So this is part of the reason why everybody experiences it differently. But I will tell you, with early onset Alzheimer's disease, which is the rarer form of Alzheimer's, and it shows up before the age of 65 versus the typical Alzheimer's disease is after the age of 65. It typically is a faster progressing process. So it moves more quickly. People go through it more quickly than the typical Alzheimer's disease. The average person lives with Alzheimer's disease from, anywhere from 8 to 15 years after the onset of the symptoms. They become noticeable. My grandmother was a 20-year.
Yeah.
So early onset typically moves faster than the traditional Alzheimer's. It does show up in younger years. And it is genetic. So people who carry the APOE4 gene would have a much higher risk of developing early onset or even regular Alzheimer's than somebody who doesn't carry that gene. But it still doesn't mean that you will definitely develop it. It just puts you at a higher risk, but there's so many other things that put people at a higher risk as well. So
I can't wait to get to that, because there's probably, so many myths and so many, fears around what causes Alzheimer's. And we're all just kind of doing this guessing game. And I'm so happy you mentioned the APOE. And they've been saying, people have been doing this genetic test. And to me, it's sort of the same as the BRCA test for breast cancer. Just because you have it does not mean you're going to develop it, but it does give you more knowledge that you have a higher predisposition genetically to do it. And I cannot remember who Matthew said, one of the celebrities, I think it was Ryan Reynolds, but they had taken the test.
Oh, that's Chris Hemsworth.
Oh, Chris Hemsworth. Yeah. Where did I get Ryan Reynolds?
Now, he took the genetic test, and he actually is carrying 2 APOE4 genes. So he got it from both his parents. That's very, very unusual and rare.
Okay.
But does that mean, carrying 2 APOE4 genes, does that mean that, he's kind of sunk and he's definitely going to get it? No. It just puts him at double the risk of somebody carrying one gene or somebody carrying no genes.
Oh, see, I thank you for clarifying that. I'm so happy that you mentioned that. Now, my understanding is, it's the frontal lobe, and we have, these arteries and basically, from what I understand, and it's very also common with ADHD as well, is they sort of fray like a rope. And that's where we start slowing this cognitive receptors and the memory and the impulsiveness sort of reaction. Tell us if that's true, or if you can elaborate a little better than I just did.
Sure. All right. So as I mentioned, the most common form of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. The hallmark of Alzheimer's disease is it attacks first, the short-term memory. And upon autopsy, most people the doctors can see that these what's called plaques and tangles, which are tau proteins and tangles, have formed over the brain. They spread, they atrophy the brain, so the brain's shrinking, and they basically, I guess, for lack of a better way to describe it, they really are suffocating your brain.
Okay.
But there's also, as I mentioned, over 100 known brain diseases that cause dementia. And talking about the frontal lobe, there is a dementia called frontotemporal lobe dementia. Now, the hallmark of that one is attacking the frontal temporal lobe part of your brain. And that's our thinking center. That's where where our emotions are controlled, and our reasoning and being able to rationalize things. So for people that are suffering from frontotemporal lobe dementia, their behaviors are going to look different than somebody who's suffering from Alzheimer's disease, because they are more than likely to just be losing their short-term memory. But a lot of people, the symptoms are intertwined. You can have somebody with Alzheimer's disease, but they are showing paranoia, like my grandmother, and they have angry outbursts and their personalities change, which is in the temporal lobe part of the brain. But we still see the impact of the changing brain with Alzheimer's disease in those arenas. So, and then again, to complicate the situation even more, what if the person is suffering from several types of brain diseases that are causing? Then you're all over
Yes, that's what I was just going to ask you, is what other diseases tend to get, sort of misdiagnosed as dementia or Alzheimer's, or vice versa? Because I know in doing studies, myself, my son has ADHD, my daughter has ADHD. So very genetically, we have these ADHD things, and it is receptors, and it is impulsiveness, emotion control. I did see a lot of combative patients when I worked with Alzheimer's. And so there is a lot of misconception. Do you think that there are some diagnoses that get misdiagnosed that should be dementia, or some that are diagnosed as dementia that are something else? What do you see, or what have you experienced with that?
Well, if we are referring to dementia kind of in a generalized term, so I don't know of anybody who has developed Alzheimer's disease that doesn't have dementia. But there are many people, Michael J. Fox is an example, who has Parkinson's disease with no dementia. So that's one of the diseases, neurological diseases, that comes with dementia, or you don't show the cognitive decline. Huntington's disease is another one. But when we're referring to dementia kind of as a generalized term, a lot of the brain diseases do cause dementia. And it really, what it comes down to is what part of the brain is being damaged first. So like I said, if you have Alzheimer's disease, your short-term memory is probably the first part of your brain to be attacked. If you're suffering from Lewy body disease, you're developing Lewy bodies in your brain, and that's a different part of your brain. And so your symptoms might be a little bit different or varied from the person with the Alzheimer's disease. So, and then if you have mixed dementia, then, several parts of your brain could be being attacked and damaged simultaneously. And so that's why I say everybody kind of experiences it differently. And it's there's nothing really set in stone that, okay, well, you have Alzheimer's disease, so this is what you can expect, because everybody goes through it differently.
Gosh, it's
What
it's so intricate and complicated for, medical professionals to even diagnose. I mean, listening to what you're saying, I can see how misdiagnosing or underdiagnosing would be so prevalent, and why you doing this advocacy and awareness is, we've got to do more research. We've got to do better. We have to really, we really need to get serious about this. I happen
the other
to
thing that makes this disease so difficult, especially for the families, is, and this is a fact, most people are not even diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease till they're already well into their mid stages. And the reason why, and you probably know this, Maureen, from your background working with Alzheimer's patients, is the signs and the symptoms are so subtle in the beginning. It's very difficult to differentiate between the normal aging and the forgetfulness that goes with normal aging.
Yeah.
Mild cognitive impairment that sometimes does advance to Alzheimer's disease, but not always. And so by the time somebody's symptoms are so blatantly obvious that the family takes them to the doctor, or the doctor's able to really, pay attention to what the symptomology is, they're already into their mid stages of the disease. And that makes things even more complicated for everybody involved, because it's like, okay, well, now we have to be reactive versus proactive, because now there's no question that there's something going on. And my probably biggest takeaway from all the way back to my grandmother showing signs of dementia, and back then they called it senile dementia. They didn't even refer to it as Alzheimer's back then, to 7 other family members. Oh, and by the way, I also had a dog with doggy dementia.
Oh my God.
That's another story.
She said dogs, listeners, my heart just sunk, but that's a real
dogs
thing.
Get dementia. And when my dog was about 13 years old, no, 15, I started noticing a lot of the same behaviors that I had been observing in humans for decades. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, am I just reading into things? I didn't know dogs got dementia. So anyway, I took him to the vet, and the vet said, oh, Lisa, no, you're spot on. Dogs definitely get dementia. We call it cognitive, canine cognitive dysfunction, and it's synonymous with our Alzheimer's disease. And 50%, the statistic now is 50% of dogs will develop it starting in, 12, 13 years old. And for the same reason that we as humans do, we're living longer.
Yeah.
We have so many medical advances to treat all these diseases and things to keep our bodies alive, but we have nothing that we know of that can maintain the integrity of our brain. So that's why those statistics are now so high. Half of the dogs starting at age 13 are showing signs of
canine
cognitive decline. And my dog lived till he was 18 and a half years old.
Oh my word, which is like a record in itself. That is so that is really a longevity for any dog, even our littler dogs who tend to live a little bit longer. I want to go back to what you said about how most of the time they don't get diagnosed till they're in the mid stages. So my experience with my grandmother, and my grandmother lived literally a block away from me and like 10 houses down from me. And so she literally was my second mom, and I stopped there for breakfast before getting the school bus. And I remember, so I'd seen her often, and I remember going to her house. She had lost her checkbook. She said, I don't know if I left it at the bank. And I'm like, oh no, we're going to find your thing. Then she proceeded to tell me, and she was still driving at this time, she was 80. And she proceeded to tell me she got lost on the way to somewhere where she has lived for, I mean, she lived there for, 20, 30 years. And she got lost on her way going to, it was the bank or Walmart or something like that. I instantly saw it. I had worked with people, right? I mean, I'm no expert, I'm no doctor or anything like that, but I had seen enough to know, hey, something serious is going on. I go to my parents and I said, I'm really concerned. I don't think you should let grandma drive anymore. I'm really concerned she got lost. She lost her checkbook. And my mom and dad, bless their hearts, said, well, the doctor said she's fine. And I said, but she's not fine. I said, let's just have her checked out. Finally, what happened was she fell over. She had a UTI. She wasn't feeding herself. She wasn't taking her high blood pressure medication. She ends up in the hospital. And then my parents essentially are forced to take her in. I said, we need to get a caseworker. We need somewhere where she can have specialized care. My father had a heart problem. My mother worked full time. And we could not get the assistance, which I'm looking forward to some resources from you, could not get the assistance to get her into a place where we could get her to be taken care of. She did live to be 95 years old.
Oh, wow.
I know, unbelievable. But as you and I both know, usually when it comes to Alzheimer's, the body can outlast the mind. And usually the ones that I've seen in my own informal research and working with them was their bodies were healthy. I mean, they were go-getters. They were up and they were little escape artists. And so what is that in relation to why does that happen? Why is the brain essentially kind of checked out, but the body is much healthier than a lot of us who, still have our cognitive functions?
Yeah, and that's actually very common. I've seen that with so many people suffering from dementia. And my grandmother, that was true of my grandmother too. She was healthy, but her brain was declining very rapidly, or much more rapidly than the rest of her body. Yeah. Probably because we know so much more about how to take care of our bodies than our brains.
Nice.
And I'm talking about like lifestyle choices, like the best foods to eat, getting regular exercise, exercising your brain. These are all things that can help minimize your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease that we either aren't aware of or maybe don't take it as seriously as we should, because you can start all those things today, even if you're, 40 years away from 65 years old. But there's been so many studies done in the last, 2-3 decades that show a distinctive correlation between lifestyle choices and your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And, it was even true with my little dog, Oliver. I mean, he was as healthy as a horse right up till the very end, but he clearly didn't know what planet he was on. He really didn't. And because of my experience with humans, I knew how to kind of manage that. And he had a really happy life. He just, his mind was just gone. I think my biggest takeaway from everything I've seen and learned and, professional experience, personal experience, I think that my biggest takeaway for almost 50 years of kind of being involved with this disease, starting with my grandma, is the key to having this end up being a more positive experience for everybody involved. If you're a caretaker or you're a family member or the person who has the disease, is for people who are not directly involved, but our family members or friends or caregivers, to know as much as you possibly can about the disease, so you'll know what to look for and what to expect, and then learn how to properly respond to, like, somebody telling you that birds are living in their mattress and coming out at night and pecking at your face. And I think that's really the best place to start, because there are very specific skills that it takes to provide a person with the best quality of life. And most of those skills are actually counterintuitive to our instinctive response. And I'll use my grandmother as an example. Instead of me arguing with her and trying to correct her and steer her back into my reality and telling her, "Oh, grandma, I don't, you're nuts. What you're telling me couldn't be possible." Just joining her reality and making her think it was okay to that, I believed what she was saying. But that's not our gut reaction. Our instinctive reaction is, "Oh my goodness, this is my grandma. I got to fix her. There's something wrong with her. I've got to do something to bring her back to my world." But
I think we try to, or our minds tend to see them as children, and we want to correct them the way we've corrected children. And this is not the same, even though they are childlike they do end up, having sort of these imaginary things that are happening. And I remember working in the Alzheimer's unit, and they do have long-term memory. And I would have this one really sweet lady who would always say, the kids are going to be home from school and my husband's coming. And like you, I think they try to discourage us doing what you're saying. And I felt so strongly about doing what you're saying, which was let him be, let him have this reality. And so she would say, "My husband's coming home. I got to make dinner. The kids are coming home." And all I had on the unit, the nursing unit, was just a basket of laundry. And I say, "Well, here, go ahead and do the laundry, before they get home." I mean, and especially because they're in a locked unit. I mean, they can only go so far. We had a little patio for them, but they've come a long way with memory care facilities. And there were some, I live in Texas now, but in Arizona, they had some fantastic facilities where they called them guests and neighbors, not patients. And their med carts were dressers, and they had little sections where they had like costumes, like they could dress up as firemen, and then they had some where they had dolls and like stuff. Like, it was great. It was fantastic. They had a freedom. There wasn't like, you can't put them in a cage, and because they're only going to get more combative and they're only going to fight you, and there's no reason to do that. Like, just let them exist in their reality and join them in that reality, like you said. And I did work for a corporation for 27 years, Banner Healthcare in Arizona, and they are doing really big things on Alzheimer's research. So Banner Alzheimer's Institute is doing really great things to do more research. I want to ask you, I had a Christmas miracle, and I still to this day don't know why this happened. So my grandmother, we know, was full-blown Alzheimer's. She ended up in a nursing home. And I remember the first time she didn't know me. And that was the biggest gut-wrenching knife in the heart. I understood it, but it hurt me when she didn't recognize me for the first time. But I remember going on a Christmas Eve just before she passed. And she's sitting in the dining hall, and I come in there and I said, "It's Christmas Eve. They're playing Christmas music." And she had a moment of complete coherent clarity. Why does that happen? My sister had the same experience. It wasn't very often. It was just this one time, and it was Christmas Eve, and she passed in March. And I still to this day am like, thank you for that gift, Grandma. But is that something that you hear happens, where there's this moment where you're like, they're fine, they're still there, no, there's nothing wrong with them? Why do they have moments like that?
I'll tell you. And if people listening don't take anything else away from this conversation, what I am about to tell you is probably the most important thing that you can know about what is happening to the person with Alzheimer's disease. And it's going to explain to you why that happened. So this is the best explanation that I have come up with to help people understand answering this question. Think of, now I told you the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease is it attacks the short-term memory first. Okay, so think of that short-term memory being hooked up with a switch, like a light is hooked up to a switch that can be turned on and turned off. Now, in the very beginning stages of the disease, that short-term memory switch is on more than it's off. So the short-term memory is functioning pretty normally. Once in a while, that switch goes off, but it's very, it's not that noticeable. By the middle stage of the disease, and this is where most people are diagnosed, that short-term memory switch flips on and off, on and off, on and off constantly. And you don't have a moment's notice. And then by the end of the disease, some people's short-term memory switch goes off permanently, and then they're pulling from their long-term memories, which does stay intact for the entire duration of the disease. And some people, their switch is off much more than it's on. So with that said, somebody can be in a previous period of their life because they're at the stage of their disease where their short-term memory switch is off more than it's on. But then on the turn of a dime, it flips back on. And now they are back on the same timeline that we are on. And it happens like that. And that is the best explanation I have ever been able to kind of come up with. And I can't tell you how many people say, that makes so much sense to me now. So what you have to do with that information is listen for their cues. If that switch is off, so basically their short-term memory just malfunctioned. They have no short-term memory while that switch is off. They are pulling from their long-term memories, and everybody kind of is pulling from a different part of their past. You have to listen to what they're talking about so you can tell if they are referring to their present time, but they're really in their past. Like they're looking for their kids. They're wondering where their mother is, who's been gone for years. So if you follow their cues, you're going to know if that switch is on or if that switch is off. So in your particular situation, when you went to visit her, when you first started the conversation or the visit with her, her short-term memory switch was off. And she didn't know who you were because you hadn't been born in her life yet. She was too young to have probably even been married, let alone had a grown daughter, because her short-term memory switch was temporarily off. So she didn't recognize you. She knew that she knew you somehow, but she didn't actually know you were her daughter or your name or what your name was. Then all of a sudden, out of the blue, that switch goes back on and she knows exactly who you are because now she's moved from somewhere in her past to the present time. So to give you an example, my mother-in-law was one of the 8 family members, and her short-term memory switch, was on, was off, was on, was off. So one day she was over at our house visiting, and we were having what seemed to be like a normal conversation, and her short-term memory seemed to be working just fine. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, she stood up and she said, I have to go home. I have to go home. Marty's waiting for me. He needs his dinner. And Marty was her husband, my father-in-law, and he had been gone for 6 years. Well, that short-term memory switch flipped off for that very moment, and she was all just panicking, thinking that he was at home waiting for her. So what I did was I said, oh no, he knows you're here and you're having a nice visit. And he wanted me to tell you, I just got off the phone with him and he wanted me to tell you that he's so happy that you're having a nice visit with your son and our son and your daughter-in-law. Take your time and I'll eat dinner when you get home. And she said, are you sure? For real? And I said, oh, yes, for sure. So let's just visit for a few more minutes and then I'll take you home. That completely settled her down. But see how quickly that switch goes from off to on and vice versa? So you have to listen for the cues. And my cue that her switch went off was that her husband was alive and well and waiting for her at home, waiting for her to fix him dinner when he had been buried 6 years earlier. But there's nothing I could have said. I couldn't have said, oh, Mom, don't you remember? Dad passed away 6 years ago. What are you talking about? I mean, that could have been like she was hearing it for the first time, because in her mind, she wasn't aware of it. She thought he was fine. Right. You have to be really careful how you respond to these false beliefs.
Yeah.
Until the switch goes back on.
You're right. That is a really great depiction of how it happened. And I also feel that, so my grandmother was completely deaf. I mean, nerve deaf. They think it was either scarlet fever or she says she got dropped on her head, but I don't believe that. But she started going deaf around 18, 19 years old. And then she progressively got worse, got hearing aids, and was officially completely deaf by the age of, I think, 35. So she hadn't heard music for a very long time. I almost feel like when I said to her, it's Christmas Eve, they're playing Christmas music, she read lips. I said, they're playing Christmas music. Look at the Christmas trees. And she knew me. She knew asked about my kids. And she said, oh, are they playing this song? And I said, what's your favorite Christmas carol, Grandma? And she said, oh, this is my favorite one. It was just such a beautiful moment. And I'm going to say this. I went to my parents' house and they were like, I don't know what you're talking about. We have never seen that. My mother was there faithfully. That was her mother-in-law. She was there faithfully every week. And my mother never saw that. And when I told my parents, they said, that's so weird. Your sister said she had a moment like that too. So I don't know. There's so much we don't know about the human mind and the human spirit. I feel like maybe there was just this connection. She gave this to my sister and I as like a parting gift or a way of just validating her love for us. And I thought it was interesting because my mom and my grandmother had a very difficult relationship. Although my mother was always there, my father was an only child, but my sister and I had this beautiful relationship with my grandma. So that was my takeaway, that it was a Christmas miracle and a Christmas gift that she gave to me before she passed.
Well, that's an absolutely heartwarming and beautiful story. But I do want to mention real quickly that we know that music triggers memories for people with dementia. So probably that was part of what you experienced, was the hearing the music triggered memories for her. Yeah. Or it was a situation where that switch all of a sudden just flipped on when it had been off. So based on what you told me, it could have been either or, because she could have been recognizing the Christmas music from, even if her switch was off, from her past, because she was familiar with the Christmas tunes, versus all of a sudden
she couldn't hear them. She was completely deaf. She couldn't. So, and that's the interesting thing. She hadn't heard music since she was, in her early 20s. So It was kind of cool to simultaneously, like you said, see sort of the short term and the long term were all there. It was my grandma for that moment. It was like, oh my gosh, there she is. And she brought me such a moment of joy. So as we wrap up, I want you to give us all of the information of where can people go if they're concerned about a relative, if they're taking care of a relative, or they think they might have their own cognitive issues, and how do they reach out to you to get information or even just ask you a question?
So, a couple different ways. I have a blog on Facebook, and it's called LisaSkinnerAuthor. You can send me a message through the blog. Okay. You can actually email me if you want at Dementia Whisperer and the number 1 at gmail.com. And if you want to send me an email, I will get back to you. And I also host a podcast myself called Truth, Lies, and Alzheimer's, the Truth, Lies, and Alzheimer's Show. And it's on a network called Passionate World Talk Radio. And that show is aired every Wednesday, once a week. And a lot of the things that we talked about today and a lot of other really valuable and useful tips and resources I talk about every week. They're also on my blog. And as you mentioned, there's couple books out there that are available on Amazon. But yeah, anything you can do to educate yourself about this disease will make your journey through this really difficult disease so much easier, because then you will be prepared for anything that shows up. And they, they come out of nowhere. It's like the California earthquake.
Or the Texas humidity.
Yes.
I really love that. Her books, guys, Truth, Lies, and Alzheimer's, Its Secret Faces, and Not All Who Wander Need Be Lost. I love everything. I think that's amazing. The podcast, the email, and the Facebook, guys, I'll have all of that in her episode. So, it's nice to have a support system and to have someone like you with such a service-giving soul and heart to want to help others, because we have our struggles. I say I'm now the voice my younger self needed, and you are also the voice that your younger self needed, learning all of this. And even the canine dementia is, near and dear to me, because the dogs are everything. So I thank you so much, Miss Lisa Skinner, for being here today, for all of the information. I could have talked to you for 3 more hours, because I'm just fascinated by it. And like I said, we did have a guest who tells his story about his journey with his wife, and it's just heartwarming. And he did everything he could possibly do for her. The most loving man and loving love story of someone who didn't have all the answers, who had no support, who had no idea how to manage this, how to navigate through this whole thing. And I'd love to put you guys in touch, because he's trying to also raise the awareness for Alzheimer's and study, so others can get earlier diagnosis and possibly medication to slow the process, and all those things that need improved in today's world. So thank you, my beautiful soul, for being here and for giving us an hour of your life. That
you are so welcome. It was my pleasure.
Priceless. All right, listeners. Well, that's going to do it for this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did, and I hope it really helps those of you who are going through any situation, or even in the future. This will be something that you can, that seed can be in your mind, and you can say, I heard this wonderful woman talk about Alzheimer's on a podcast. I want to reach out. So we're here to help everybody build this community, give you hope and help and support and encouragement. It's what we're about, lifting the community, lifting each other, and just helping us through this thing called life. If you guys need any life coaching, you know where to find me. I also coach neurodivergence, which we're talking of brain things. Anyone who has on the autistic spectrum or ADHD, OCD, any neurodivergence, I am there. I am one of you. And so what better person to help than someone who gets what you're going through. So lifecoachmaureen.com, my books, My Dog is More Enlightened Than I Am, and My Dog is My Relationship Coach. And of course, our online boutique, mydogiseverything.net, healthy treats, and even treats that have CBD in them, which has been known to help brain function. So we can tie that into preventing some canine dementia. So our treats are all homemade, no preservatives, no additives, no xylitol in our peanut butters, no preservatives. It's organic PB&J treats in our jelly. So all the good stuff for your puppies. So I'm going to let you go for now. And I appreciate you all. Thanks for listening. Thank you for your 5-star reviews. Reach out to me if you want to be a guest, or if you want to get a hold of any of our guests, or if you just want to talk and say, hey, how's it going? I'm here for it. So until next week, take care of yourself, take care of each other. Most of all, take care of those furry babies. Please adopt and don't shop. Love you all till next week. Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the I Never Knew podcast. If you found today's episode inspiring and educational, please be sure to follow, subscribe, and spread the word. The more people that join the Inc. community, the more it can develop and influence others as we work together for a healthier and brighter future. Until next time.